We are going to talk about 18 cities in Ontario where home prices will crash. I will not waste your time in hooks, but please don't waste number 15 to 2007. Let's start with number 18, Sault Ste. Marie. The Steel City's housing market is built on foundations that are rapidly eroding beneath the surface. Sault Ste. Marie faces a perfect storm of economic challenges that make a housing correction almost inevitable. The city's dependence on traditional manufacturing and its aging population create vulnerabilities that few other Ontario markets share. Here's what makes this situation critical. Algoma Steel, the city's largest employer, has been struggling with production cuts and workforce reductions for the past 2 years. When a single employer dominates a local economy to this extent, housing demand becomes dangerously concentrated. The ripple effects are already visible in decreased retail activity and reduced municipal tax revenues. The demographic data tells an even more concerning story. Sault Ste. Marie has one of Ontario's fastest aging populations, with young professionals leaving for opportunities in larger centers. This creates a double impact. Fewer buyers entering the market while more seniors look to downsize or relocate closer to family and urban areas. The city's population has declined by nearly 8% over the past decade, yet housing prices increased dramatically during the pandemic boom. What makes this particularly significant is the oversupply situation developing in certain neighborhoods. New subdivision developments that seemed reasonable in 2021 are now struggling to find buyers, while the resale market shows increasing days on market and price reductions. Local real estate agents report that homes priced above $300,000 are sitting unsold for months. The emotional reality is harsh for current homeowners who bought at peak prices. Many families are discovering that their largest investment is becoming a liability, with carrying costs exceeding rental equivalents while property values stagnate or decline. The stress of being financially trapped in a declining market affects not just individual families, but entire communities. But if you think Sault Ste. Marie's challenges are unique, wait until you see what's happening in our next city, where government dependency creates even greater market instability. Number 17, North Bay. Government cutbacks and demographic shifts are creating a housing market time bomb that most residents don't see coming. North Bay's economy relies heavily on government employment, making it extremely vulnerable to policy changes and budget cuts that could devastate local housing demand virtually overnight. Here's the alarming reality. Nearly 40% of North Bay's workforce depends directly or indirectly on government employment, from the Canadian Forces Base to provincial government offices. Recent federal budget discussions about military base consolidations and provincial talks about administrative centralization pose existential threats to the local economy that housing prices haven't yet reflected. The city faces additional pressure from its role as a regional service center. As rural populations decline and smaller communities lose services, North Bay absorbs some of this population. But these new residents typically have lower incomes and different housing needs than the professionals who drove previous price growth. This creates downward pressure on home values while increasing demand for rental properties. What makes this situation particularly precarious is the infrastructure deficit. North Bay's municipal infrastructure requires significant investment, but the tax base can't support necessary improvements without substantial rate increases. This creates a vicious cycle where higher taxes reduce affordability, while deteriorating infrastructure reduces property desirability. The real-world impact is already visible in neighborhood-level data. Homes in areas dependent on government employment are showing the first signs of value stagnation, while properties near potential base closure zones are already experiencing reduced buyer interest. Local mortgage brokers report increasing difficulty placing loans for properties above certain price points. The psychological effect on the community is equally concerning. When economic uncertainty combines with housing market instability, consumer confidence plummets, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of reduced spending and further economic contraction. Our next location faces even more complex challenges, where tourism dependency creates seasonal vulnerabilities that could trigger year-round housing corrections. Number 16, Timmins. The gold rush mentality that drove recent housing prices ignores the fundamental economic realities that make this market unsustainable. Timmins represents one of Ontario's most volatile housing markets, where resource sector boom and bust cycles create extreme price swings that catch homeowners unprepared for the inevitable corrections. Here's what makes Timmins particularly vulnerable. The city's economy remains heavily tied to gold mining, with recent commodity price increases creating artificial housing demand that doesn't reflect long-term economic fundamentals. When gold prices inevitably moderate, the local economy faces severe contraction that housing prices must follow. The mining industry's capital-intensive nature means employment can change rapidly based on corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms. Recent automation initiatives at major local mines are reducing workforce requirements while increasing productivity, creating a scenario where economic output remains stable but employment and housing demand decline significantly. What makes this correction almost inevitable is the demographic challenge. Timmins attracts workers during boom periods, but these populations are typically mobile and leave quickly when conditions change. The permanent resident base isn't large enough to support current housing price levels without the temporary mining workforce that could disappear with little warning. Local housing data reveals dangerous signs that most residents are ignoring. Inventory levels are climbing while average days on market extend beyond seasonal norms. Properties dependent on mining employment are showing the first signs of price softness, particularly in developments built during the recent boom period. The real-life impact affects families who invested their mining bonuses into homeownership, assuming current income levels would continue indefinitely. These households face potential financial devastation when the inevitable downturn arrives, with limited equity to cushion the blow and few alternative employment opportunities locally. But our next city's challenges stem from entirely different sources, where urban planning mistakes create housing market vulnerabilities that few people understand. Number 15, Sudbury. Decades of economic diversification attempts can't overcome fundamental structural problems that make housing corrections inevitable. Sudbury's housing market faces unique pressures from environmental legacy issues and changing economic patterns that create long-term headwinds for property values. Here's the concerning reality. Sudbury's economy has been transitioning away from mining dominance for decades, but this transition hasn't created the stable, high-paying employment necessary to support current housing price levels. The city's efforts to become a regional service and education center have succeeded partially, but haven't generated sufficient economic momentum to sustain recent price growth. The environmental rehabilitation efforts, while admirable, create ongoing costs and uncertainties that affect property values in subtle but significant ways. Areas with historical contamination concerns face perpetual challenges in attracting buyers, while remediation costs reduce municipal resources available for infrastructure and services that support property values. What makes this situation particularly complex is the university dependency. Laurentian University's recent financial difficulties and program cuts have reduced enrollment and eliminated hundreds of jobs, creating ripple effects throughout the local economy. When a major institution downsizes, the impact on housing demand extends far beyond direct employment, affecting everything from local retail to professional services. The demographic trends compound these economic challenges. Young graduates increasingly leave Sudbury for opportunities in larger centers, while the aging population creates different housing needs that don't support current price levels. The city faces a brain drain that reduces long-term economic prospects while increasing social service costs. For homeowners, the emotional toll of watching their community struggle while their largest investment stagnates creates stress that affects families and neighborhoods. The uncertainty about Sudbury's economic future makes long-term planning nearly impossible, creating additional pressure on housing demand. Our next location faces a different set of challenges, where geographic isolation creates market vulnerabilities that recent price growth has ignored. Number 14, Thunder Bay. Geographic isolation and transportation costs create economic headwinds that housing prices can't indefinitely ignore. Thunder Bay's remote location, while offering certain lifestyle advantages, creates fundamental economic constraints that make current housing prices unsustainable, given local income levels and employment prospects. Here's what makes Thunder Bay's situation unique. The city serves as a regional hub for northwestern Ontario, but this role is diminishing as transportation patterns change and resource extraction becomes more automated. The traditional advantages of geographic position are being eroded by technological changes that reduce the need for regional service centers. The transportation infrastructure that once supported Thunder Bay's economy now represents a cost burden rather than an advantage. Rail and shipping facilities require ongoing investment while generating fewer local jobs, creating a situation where infrastructure costs are socialized while benefits are increasingly captured elsewhere. What makes this correction likely is the employment trend data. Major employers have been gradually reducing local workforce while maintaining or increasing operations through automation and remote management. This creates a scenario where economic activity appears stable while local purchasing power and housing demand decline steadily. The university and college presence provide some stability, but recent enrollment trends and funding pressures suggest this support may be weakening. When educational institutions face budget constraints, the impacts on local housing markets are typically severe and long-lasting. Real families are already feeling these pressures. Young professionals who might have stayed in Thunder Bay a generation ago now relocate for better opportunities, leaving behind a housing market increasingly dependent on an aging population with different housing needs and limited capacity to support current price levels. But geographic challenges pale in comparison to what's happening in our next city, where industrial transformation creates housing market upheaval that few residents anticipate. Number 13, Sarnia. Chemical industry transformation and cross-border economic shifts are creating housing market pressures that current prices haven't recognized. Sarnia's integration with the broader Great Lakes industrial economy creates vulnerabilities that local housing markets can't escape, particularly as traditional chemical manufacturing faces fundamental changes. Here's the critical issue. Sarnia's economy depends heavily on petrochemical manufacturing, an industry undergoing rapid transformation due to environmental regulations and changing energy markets. While some facilities are adapting successfully, others face uncertain futures that create employment instability, affecting thousands of families. The cross-border employment patterns that traditionally supported Sarnia's housing market are weakening as Detroit's economy evolves and border crossing becomes more complex. Many Sarnia residents historically worked in Michigan while living in Ontario, but this pattern is declining, reducing local purchasing power and housing demand. What makes this situation particularly concerning is the infrastructure aging. Chemical industry facilities require constant investment to maintain environmental compliance and operational efficiency. When companies choose to invest elsewhere rather than upgrading Sarnia operations, the economic impacts are severe and often permanent. The housing market data shows early warning signs that most residents are missing. Properties in neighborhoods heavily dependent on chemical industry employment are showing increased time on market and reduced buyer interest. Local mortgage originators report growing difficulty qualifying borrowers whose employment depends on potentially vulnerable facilities. For families whose livelihoods depend on Sarnia's industrial base, the uncertainty creates daily stress about both employment and housing values. The community's economic identity is changing, but housing prices haven't adjusted to reflect new realities. Our next city faces even more dramatic economic transition, where service sector growth can't offset manufacturing decline. Number 12, Windsor. Automotive industry restructuring and demographic changes are creating perfect conditions for significant housing corrections. Windsor's economy remains too dependent on automotive manufacturing at a time when the industry faces unprecedented transformation that local housing markets haven't recognized. Here's what makes Windsor particularly vulnerable. The automotive industry is undergoing the most dramatic transformation in its history, with electric vehicle transitions, supply chain restructuring, and automation reducing traditional manufacturing employment. While Windsor has attracted some new investment, it hasn't offset job losses from plant closures and downsizing at traditional facilities. The cross-border employment that traditionally supported Windsor's housing market is becoming increasingly complex and unreliable. Changes in trade policies, border security, and remote work patterns are reducing the number of Windsor residents who can depend on Detroit area employment, cutting a crucial source of housing demand. What makes this correction almost inevitable is the demographic shift. Windsor's population is aging while young professionals increasingly relocate to Toronto or other centers with better career opportunities. This creates a double pressure: reduced buyer pool combined with increased selling pressure from downsizing seniors. The university presence provides some economic diversification, but student housing needs differ significantly from the single-family homes that drove recent price increases. The mismatch between housing stock and changing demand patterns creates additional downward pressure on values. Local families are already experiencing the stress of economic uncertainty combined with housing market instability. Many households that depended on automotive employment are discovering that their skills don't translate easily to other industries, while their home equity represents their only significant asset in a declining market. But automotive dependency is just one type of economic vulnerability, as we'll see in our next city, where government employment creates different but equally serious housing market risks. Number 11, Kingston. Government employment dependency and student housing oversupply are creating conditions for significant price corrections in Canada's former capital. Kingston's seemingly stable economy masks underlying vulnerabilities that make the housing market more fragile than most residents realize. Here's the troubling reality. Kingston's economy depends heavily on government employment, from federal correctional facilities to military installations, making it vulnerable to policy changes and budget cuts that could devastate local housing demand. Recent discussions about prison system reforms and military base consolidations pose direct threats to thousands of local jobs. The university sector, while providing economic diversity, creates housing market distortions that aren't sustainable. Queen's University enrollment has peaked while student housing construction continued, creating oversupply in certain market segments. When student demand weakens, the ripple effects impact the broader housing market as landlords compete for fewer tenants. What makes this situation particularly precarious is the infrastructure challenge. Kingston's historic charm comes with costly maintenance requirements for aging municipal infrastructure. The tax base can't support necessary investments without significant rate increases that reduce housing affordability while potentially driving residents to more cost-effective communities. The demographic trends compound these economic vulnerabilities. While Kingston attracts retirees seeking historic charm and cultural amenities, this population shift changes housing demand patterns in ways that don't support current price levels across all market segments. For current homeowners, the combination of economic uncertainty and demographic change creates anxiety about both employment prospects and property values. Families who invested in Kingston for stability are discovering that government employment isn't as secure as previously assumed. Our next location faces similar government dependency issues, but with additional complications from rural economic decline. Number 10, Peterborough. Economic diversification efforts can't overcome fundamental demographic and geographic challenges that make housing corrections inevitable. Peterborough's transition from manufacturing to service economy hasn't created sufficient high-paying employment to support recent housing price increases. Here's what makes Peterborough's situation critical. The city's efforts to reinvent itself as a technology and service center have shown some success, but haven't generated enough well-paying jobs to support current housing prices. The gap between housing costs and local incomes has grown to unsustainable levels that must eventually correct. The geographic position that once supported Peterborough's economy now creates challenges in attracting and retaining businesses. Companies seeking proximity to Toronto markets often choose locations with better transportation access, while those prioritizing cost reduction select communities with lower operating expenses than Peterborough can offer. What makes this correction likely is the demographic pressure. Peterborough attracts retirees and commuters, but struggles to retain young professionals who drive housing demand and community growth. The aging population creates different housing needs while reducing the tax base needed to support municipal services and infrastructure. The university presence helps stabilize the economy, but Trent University's enrollment challenges and funding pressures suggest this support may be weakening. Real families are already feeling the pressure of housing costs that exceed local earning potential. Many residents commute to Toronto area jobs, but rising transportation costs and remote work trends are making this pattern less viable, potentially reducing housing demand from this crucial demographic. But commuting dependency creates even greater vulnerabilities in our next city, where distance from major employment centers makes housing corrections almost inevitable. Number 9. Barrie commuter town economics are failing as remote work trends and transportation costs create perfect conditions for housing market corrections. Barrie's housing market depends entirely on Greater Toronto Area employment patterns that are changing in ways that make current price levels unsustainable. Here's the fundamental problem. Barrie's housing prices are based on Toronto-level incomes, but most residents face significant commuting costs that effectively reduce their purchasing power. As transportation costs rise and remote work reduces commuting frequency, the economic justification for Barrie's price premium is disappearing. The infrastructure strain from rapid growth creates additional pressure on housing values. Municipal services are struggling to keep pace with development, creating quality-of-life issues that reduce Barrie's attractiveness relative to other commuter communities. Traffic congestion, overcrowded schools, and strained recreational facilities make the community less appealing to families seeking affordable alternatives to Toronto living. What makes this correction almost certain is the employment dependency. Barrie's local economy can't support current housing prices without GTA commuters, but changing work patterns are reducing this population. Companies embracing permanent remote work are allowing employees to relocate to truly affordable communities, bypassing expensive commuter towns like Barrie. The demographic shift is equally concerning. Young families that historically chose Barrie for affordable home ownership are increasingly priced out, while existing residents face financial stress from housing costs that consume excessive portions of household income. For families who stretched financially to buy in Barrie, the combination of high housing costs, transportation expenses, and economic uncertainty creates daily stress about financial sustainability. Many households are discovering that their dream of affordable homeownership has become a financial nightmare. Our next city faces similar commuter dependency issues, but with additional challenges from limited economic diversification. Number 8. Orillia tourism, seasonal economy, and limited employment diversity create housing market vulnerabilities that recent price growth has ignored. Orillia's economy lacks the diversity necessary to support housing prices that assume year-round, stable employment for most residents. Here's what makes Orillia particularly vulnerable. The local economy depends heavily on seasonal tourism and cottage country service employment that doesn't provide the stable year-round income necessary to support current housing prices. Many residents work multiple seasonal jobs to maintain their mortgages, creating financial instability that housing markets typically don't sustain long-term. The cottage country economy that supports Orillia is itself changing as wealthy Toronto area residents increasingly purchase properties in more remote locations with better amenities and investment potential. This trend reduces demand for Orillia's tourism services while increasing competition from other recreational communities. What makes this correction likely is the infrastructure limitation. Orillia's municipal infrastructure was designed for a smaller seasonal population. Rapid residential growth has strained systems without generating sufficient tax revenue to fund necessary upgrades, creating quality-of-life issues that reduce long-term housing demand. The employment prospects for young professionals are particularly limited. Most career advancement opportunities require relocating to larger centers, creating a brain drain that reduces the community's long-term economic prospects and housing demand from high-income earners. Local families are increasingly stressed by the gap between housing costs and available employment income. Many residents work in Toronto while living in Orillia, but this pattern is becoming less viable as transportation costs rise and remote work eliminates the need for expensive commuter arrangements. But seasonal economy challenges pale in comparison to what's happening in our next city, where industrial decline creates housing market pressures that few residents understand. Number 7. Oshawa, automotive industry transformation and Durham region competition create perfect conditions for significant housing corrections. Oshawa's identity as Motor City can't overcome fundamental economic changes that make current housing prices unsustainable. Here's the critical reality. General Motors' decision to end production at the Oshawa assembly plant permanently changed the city's economic foundation. While the facility has found new uses, nothing replaces the high-paying manufacturing jobs that supported Oshawa's housing market for generations. The competition within Durham region works against Oshawa's housing market. Communities like Ajax and Whitby offer similar GTA access with better amenities and municipal services, making them more attractive to buyers who can afford current price levels. Oshawa increasingly serves lower-income households who can't support premium pricing. What makes this correction inevitable is the demographic shift. Oshawa's population is aging as young professionals choose other Durham region communities or relocate entirely. The aging population has different housing needs and limited capacity to support current price levels, particularly in the single-family market that drove recent growth. The municipal financial pressure compounds housing market challenges. Oshawa faces significant infrastructure investment needs while dealing with a tax base that includes substantial industrial property requiring ongoing municipal services but generating reduced employment and economic activity. For families whose lives revolved around automotive employment, the economic transition creates stress about both current finances and future prospects. Many households that built wealth through manufacturing careers are discovering that their skills don't translate to other industries, while their home equity represents their primary financial asset in a declining market. Our next location faces different but equally serious challenges, where geographic limitations create housing market constraints that recent growth ignored. Number 6. St. Catharines, Niagara region. Economic limitations and cross-border dependency create housing market vulnerabilities that current prices don't reflect. St. Catharines represents a regional economy that can't generate sufficient high-paying employment to support recent housing price increases. Here's what makes St. Catharines particularly concerning. The city's economy depends heavily on tourism, agriculture, and cross-border commerce, none of which provide the stable, well-paying employment necessary to support current housing costs. The seasonal nature of much local employment creates income volatility that housing markets typically can't sustain long-term. The cross-border economic relationships that traditionally supported the Niagara region are weakening as trade patterns change and border crossing becomes more complex. Many local businesses that depended on American customers and workers face reduced activity that affects employment and economic stability throughout the region. What makes this correction likely is the competition from other markets. St. Catharines competes with Hamilton for buyers seeking affordable alternatives to GTA living, but Hamilton offers better employment prospects and transportation access. Hamilton's aging municipal infrastructure requires massive investment, while the city manages rapid population growth. The tax increases necessary to fund infrastructure improvements reduce housing affordability while potentially driving residents to communities with lower carrying costs. Real families are already experiencing financial stress from housing costs that consume excessive portions of household income. Many Hamilton residents work locally, but earn significantly less than required to comfortably afford current housing prices, creating unsustainable debt loads that must eventually correct through either income growth or price reduction. But manufacturing transition challenges are minor compared to what's happening in our next city, where speculation has created housing market conditions that defy economic logic. Number 3. London. University dependency and speculative investment create housing market instability that threatens dramatic corrections. London represents one of Ontario's highest-risk housing markets, where speculation has pushed prices far beyond sustainable levels relative to local economic fundamentals. Here's the shocking reality. London's housing prices increased faster than almost any other Ontario market during the pandemic boom, despite limited employment growth and economic diversification. The price increases were driven primarily by speculation and Toronto overflow demand rather than fundamental economic improvement. The university dependency creates additional vulnerability. Western university enrollment faces pressure from changing demographics and international education policy changes. When university communities face enrollment declines, the impacts on local housing markets are typically severe and long-lasting, affecting everything from student housing to family neighborhoods. What makes this correction almost inevitable is the speculation factor. London attracted investors seeking alternatives to expensive Toronto and Vancouver markets, but these buyers aren't committed to the community long-term. When market conditions change, speculative investment evaporates quickly, creating rapid price declines that trap local homeowners. The employment prospects don't support current housing costs. London's economy includes some diversified elements, but doesn't generate sufficient high-paying jobs to support price levels that assume Toronto area incomes. The gap between housing costs and local earning potential has grown to unsustainable proportions. For local families, the combination of speculation-driven prices and limited income growth creates daily financial stress. Many residents who purchased during the recent boom are discovering that their largest investment is becoming a liability, with carrying costs exceeding rental equivalents while property values face inevitable correction. Our next location represents an even more extreme example of speculation-driven pricing that ignores fundamental economic realities. Number 2. Kitchener-Waterloo technology sector concentration and speculation create housing market conditions that guarantee significant corrections. The Twin Cities represent Ontario's most overvalued housing market, where technology industry hype created price levels that fundamental economics can't support. Here's the devastating truth. Kitchener-Waterloo's housing prices assume continued growth in high-paying technology employment that regional economic conditions can't sustain. The tech sector concentration that drove recent price growth creates extreme vulnerability when industry conditions change. The speculation element is particularly dangerous in Kitchener-Waterloo. The region attracted massive investor interest based on comparisons to Silicon Valley and other tech centers, but these comparisons ignore fundamental differences in economic scale, infrastructure, and market dynamics. When speculative bubbles burst, the corrections are typically severe and prolonged. What makes this correction inevitable is the employment reality. And while Kitchener-Waterloo includes successful technology companies, the total high-paying employment isn't sufficient to support housing prices that rival Toronto levels. Many tech workers can afford current prices, but the broader population faces housing costs that are completely disconnected from local earning potential. The demographic pressure compounds market instability. The region attracted buyers from Toronto and Vancouver seeking technology sector opportunities, but many are discovering that career prospects don't justify housing costs. As remote work eliminates location dependency for technology employment, the justification for Kitchener-Waterloo's price premium disappears. For families caught in this speculative bubble, the financial and emotional stress is overwhelming. Many households stretched beyond reasonable debt loads to purchase homes based on optimistic assumptions about technology sector growth that haven't materialized as expected. But even Kitchener-Waterloo's challenges pale in comparison to our number 1 location, where multiple factors converge to create the most dangerous housing market conditions in Ontario. Number 1. Toronto. The provincial capital faces the most severe housing correction risk due to speculation, demographic shifts, and economic vulnerabilities that dwarf other Ontario markets. Toronto represents the epicenter of Ontario's housing bubble, where speculation, foreign investment, and artificial demand created price levels that no economic fundamentals can support long-term. Here's the catastrophic reality. Toronto housing prices assume unlimited demand from global investors and unlimited ability of local residents to service debt loads that consume 60–80% of household income. These assumptions are proving false as international investment patterns change and debt service capacity reaches absolute limits. The speculation factor in Toronto exceeds any other Ontario market by orders of magnitude. Billions of dollars in speculative investment pushed prices to levels that serve financial engineering rather than housing needs. When speculative demand reverses, the price corrections are typically devastating and long-lasting. What makes Toronto's correction inevitable is the affordability crisis that has reached breaking point. Essential workers can't afford to live in the city they serve, creating service delivery problems and quality of life issues that reduce Toronto's attractiveness to the high earners who might support premium housing prices. The demographic shift is already beginning. Remote work allows high-earning professionals to relocate to communities offering better value propositions, while international immigration patterns are changing in ways that reduce demand for Toronto's premium-priced housing. The assumption of unlimited demand from global sources is proving false. The economic vulnerability extends beyond housing to Toronto's entire economy. The city's high-cost structure makes it increasingly uncompetitive for business location decisions, while the housing affordability crisis reduces worker availability and increases labor costs across all sectors. For Toronto homeowners, the combination of extreme debt loads, changing demand patterns, and economic vulnerability creates financial risk that extends far beyond housing values. Many households face potential bankruptcy when the inevitable correction arrives, while the broader economic impacts affect employment, business viability, and community stability. The emotional toll on families trapped in unaffordable housing while watching their community become increasingly unlivable creates stress that affects mental health, family relationships, and social cohesion. The dream of homeownership has become a financial nightmare for many Toronto residents who believed that prices could only increase indefinitely. These 18 Ontario cities represent markets where economic fundamentals can't support current housing prices indefinitely. Understanding these vulnerabilities helps both buyers and sellers make informed decisions about timing and location. What do you think about these housing market predictions? Have you noticed signs of correction pressure in your local market, or do you disagree with our analysis of specific cities? Let us know in the comments which markets you think face the greatest correction risk and why.